Hello and welcome to the Yale Centre for British Art's online series, At Home, Artists in Conversation. I'm Gilane Tawadros, Director of the Whitechapel Gallery in London, and I'm delighted to welcome artist Gavin Jantjes to the programme today. Before we begin, I've got a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this programme will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the programme. We'll be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Gavin, and they'll be answered at the end of the programme. But please feel free to submit your questions at any time. If you'd like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking the icon on your navigation bar. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohican, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Skati Koch, Golden Pocauset, Nahantik, Quinnipiac, Algonquin, and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. So, to our wonderful artist tonight, Gavin Jantjes was born in Cape Town, South Africa, in the year the apartheid regime came to power. Gavin has spent much of his professional life in exile, and his nomadic life in Europe is echoed by his many roles in the arts. Regarded as one of South Africa's most important artists, he has worked as an artistic director, curator, educator, and historian in England, Germany, Norway, and South Africa. Jantjes has exhibited internationally, and his paintings and prints have become reference points in discussions of apartheid, cultural reciprocity, and freedom of expression. Gavin is also recognized internationally as a human rights activist and advocate of cultural diversity, and has received numerous commissions from the Nobel Peace Center, the United Nations Refugee Agency, and the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid. Painting has remained Jantjes' main creative activity. He reopened his studio when he moved to Oxfordshire in England in 2018. Welcome, Gavin.
Lovely to be here today. Thank you very much for that introduction. We're going to talk about almost 50 years of my life, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to play you a short little video that we made for Art 360, which kind of summarizes a lot of what I've done over the last 40 years. And then I'll pick it up from the end of that, and we can later on have a little discussion about what I've said. So with no ado, I am going to play the first of my slides, which I hope this works. And let's see if this goes. Yep. Here we go.
The first screen print editions Gavin Jantjes produced were made while he was a student at the Hamburg Art Academy in Germany from 1970 to 1974. He refined his screen printing technique with the help of master printers Florian Böhr and Peter Gutsche in their workshop. This enabled him to print all his editions himself. His screen prints disobeyed conventions of printmaking, using collaged material, sometimes attached with adhesive, a paperclip, or loosely placed onto the print's surface. In the early 1970s, there was no access to the World Wide Web. His imagery was gathered from magazines, libraries, and archives. He even photographed some images directly from news reports and documentaries on television. He had his first exhibition of prints in June 1976 at the Institute of Contemporary Art, the ICA, in London, the first African artist to exhibit at this prestigious UK venue founded by Sir Roland Penrose. This exhibition coincided with the Soweto uprising in South Africa. What emerged in the national press and TV media in the UK and around Europe contextualised the prints on display. Jantjes became a political refugee because of his activism in the anti-apartheid struggle, his support for the independence struggles in Africa and the civil rights struggle in the US made his early screen prints an archive of these unfolding histories. He received commissions from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and its Special Committee on Apartheid and Decolonisation. Even though his prints have an affinity with American and European pop art of the 1960s, Jantjes never identified with these movements because of their connections to consumerism. By the time Jantjes moved from Hamburg to the UK in 1982, his studio practice had moved from printmaking to painting. His first paintings were highly figurative and similar in content to his prints, focusing on political and cultural issues. He often works in series, developing ideas over canvases of similar size. In the mid-1980s, Jantjes completed a series of 7 large, untitled canvases about slavery with the genetic title Corabora. This Ghanaian word for a funeral drum also means to go away and come back. The images in the series are poetic and symbolic, and in the exhibition catalogue they are accompanied by extracts from Edward Brathwaite's epic poem The Arrivants. Each painting addresses the ineluctable facts of slavery. These narratives unfold against a backdrop of land, sea or sky. Their non-specific locations suggest that slavery was more universal than the triangle of Europe, Africa and the Americas. For his Zulu series, Jantjes retained the undefined and universal space of the night sky as a backdrop. Zulu translates as the space above your head. The series brings together ideas of cosmology, mythologies and cultural politics in a variety of paintings and drawings, and for the first time they include sculpture. At the end of the 1990s, Jantjes closed his studio. He moved to Norway and began to curate exhibitions for Hini Onstad Art Centre and the National Museum of Norway. He wrote numerous catalogues and published books and monographs on contemporary art and art history. Most importantly, a 4-volume history book on South African contemporary art. At the start of 2015, he returned to his studio and began to make non-figurative paintings. This stylistic shift maintained his method of working in series, but the removal of figures and cultural narratives marks a radical alteration to his way of working. The first outcome of his painterly research was the exogenic series Aqua in 2015, 12 large paintings about water. Since then, his painting practice remains a research of artistic freedoms that include the viewer's freedom of expression. These most recent paintings emphasize the visual over the verbal. The only narrative in these works is the history of their making. Layers of transparent colours, marks and lines create the open space in which the viewer's imagination wanders. The Sharjah Art Foundation and the Africa Institute in Sharjah will present a retrospective exhibition of his work and ideas in 2023.
So that is a short history of my life, and a life spent in the arts. And I want to pick it up with the return to the studio and learning how to see. I think that when I was curating in Norway, I became very much aware that what was happening in the arts was quite radical. There'd been a radical shift. The shift had been from going into the gallery to look, and it's been replaced by going into the gallery to read. This disturbed me because I thought that looking was essentially why we make art. So I thought I would address this when I returned to the studio and challenge myself by taking up the idea of making non-figurative work. In other words, work that had no definitive subject, had no narrative, had no imagery that was recognizable. And I call this learning to see. And I asked myself, what was left in the field of painting after postmodernity and conceptualism and post-conceptualism and all those other isms that have been in the arts, and made a series of equally sized canvases, about 14 of them, and worked on that for 2 years. And they became the Exogenic series. And I exhibited these in Oslo in Norway, which was my first exhibition in some 20 years, my first solo exhibition in some 20 years. And I then closed my studio in Oslo and moved back to the UK, and what I call the daily practice of painting, which one of my former professors, Gerd Richter, always used to say, if you're a painter, painting is a daily practice. Even if you just go into the studio just to sit down and look, it's part of what you do. You spend your life in the studio. And I think that was what was happening. And these paintings that I made when I came to the UK were made on paper, because when I arrived in the UK, I had no studio. I had to actually build my studio. And then came COVID, and what I thought was going to be done in 6 months actually took close to 2 years to do. And these works I made in my small space in the conservatory of the house that I'd moved into. And they became even smaller and smaller. This is, as you can see, quite a small painting, but a significant painting in the experiment and the challenge that I had given myself, because this was really the first time I understood what my work was trying to do. I was actually painting space. And for the first time, I realized that there was something in the foreground, there was a middle ground, there was a background, and there was a deep background. And I realized that this space was a space of imagination. It was a space in which one had to enter one's own volition. You went there not by instruction, not by coercion. It was a choice, a freedom of choice. And I had never worked on a small scale, and I started making these very small paintings called the Whitney series, of which there's most probably about, I don't know, about 50. And I continue this series. There are individual small paintings. They're about A4. And I keep doing them in between larger scale projects. And here for the first time, I was pushing this idea of this open space, this open imaginary space, which kind of reminds me of Tiepolo, the Italian Baroque painter who painted ceilings. When you stand and look at them, you're looking into a vast space of heaven. And I wanted to create that. And what was happening was that the definition of the painting was still here given by the linear marks. And I was trying to move away from that. And over a series of works, which I then began in at the middle of 21, when my studio was finally finished, I could make these larger scale works. I kept investigating this idea of the open space, the open imaginary space in which I was offering the viewer the opportunity to exercise his or her freedom of expression, freedom of interpretation, freedom of movement. You can stand in front of these, or you can move on. You don't have to be engaged with them, or they don't have to engage you. But I think that is an important aspect of the work that I was doing. And essentially realized that I was still concerned with the very same issues that I was dealing with in my earlier prints and earlier paintings, which was about personal freedoms, freedom of choice, the liberty I take to spend time in a gallery with this. And it was this process of returning to looking again rather than reading. And this has continued. And this, I suppose, will continue for quite a while. That's the large picture which I painted in Sharjah on the residency. The one before that, this one was the other. I painted two very large pictures. One is about 4 meters long. The other one is about 6 meters long. And this opportunity to make a large painting, because I couldn't do this in my own studio, was a very exciting opportunity, which I couldn't turn down. So I did that. And when I returned back to my studio, what had happened, you can see that the lines are disappearing. The pigmentation is completely different. It's a very low pigmentation. It's almost close to white. And the space has become very kind of ethereal. And I love this attitude that the paintings offer me, to let you step into it, let you make the decisions of what you want to do with what you're looking at, and literally shifting from the verbal experience to the visual experience. So these are works I've completed in the last year. This is a large painting. It's about just on 3 meters wide. And these are the next pieces I'm going to show about. They are the canvases I've been working on in the last 3 months. And as I'm working with these, I'm looking at the dissolution of form that allows me to have nothing defined. There is no completed shape in this work that you can outline and say that is a particular kind of shape. They all blend into each other. The linear mark, which was very active in the very first non-figurative works that I make, where the brush stroke was very evident, that has been reduced as far back as possible. And you have to come really close. You have to literally put your nose right up to this canvas to see the brush mark in it, if at all. And that's a painting I completed just 5 weeks ago. And it's someone I'm still contemplating where the work goes from here. But I do something every day when I enter the studio, and it kind of it gives me an attitude. It tells me something. It tells me a challenge. And I'm going to play you this. It's a piece of music, and I'll play a short part of it. Some of you may recognize it. It's something sung by Miss Nina Simone. I don't know if you can hear this. Here we go. I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish
I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say them loud, say them clear for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you would see and agree that should be free. I wish
So that's how I start my day. And I think that's how we can start this talk. I'll stop right there and return to you, Gilane, if you have any questions, which I'm sure you have.
Hello, thank you so much for that, Gavin. It's an incredibly condensed walk through your period before you left the studio and now more recently, this extraordinary body of work you've made. And I wanted to start by asking you a question about the different aspects of your life. Being an artist, being an activist, being a curator, being also a teacher. And I wondered how you saw these different aspects, because you've talked about it as very distinct periods that are delineated and separate. But I wonder just how separate they are.
Yeah, they're not that separate. They overlap. You know, while I was teaching, I was painting. While I was being an activist, I was making prints and making paintings. So these things overlap. I think I realized there was a job to be done, and I wrote about it in a conference which we did in Gaborone in Botswana in 1982, I think it was. And this conference, I presented a paper in which I spoke about the ubiquity of being an artist, for the simple reason that you were in a world that had limited the experiences of the non-European world. And there was not the globalist attitude that we have today, which is not completely perfect, but at least it's a lot more open than it used to be. When I began, meeting a Black artist was almost impossible. Even though I knew they were there, I had bothered to find out. So I had to make the extra effort. And I realized when I wrote this paper for Gaborone that you could not just be a practicing artist in a studio. That was one thing, but you were very isolated, and the chances of people engaging with your work was restricted and limited by the actual conditions of colonialism, the conditions of history, the conditions of blatant racism and exclusivity that there was in institutions, in publication, in research, at every aspect of the art world. So you had to, I decided I wanted to be active and literally put my money where my mouth was, so to speak, so that if I was criticizing and saying, you could make very good exhibitions of artists from India or from Australia or from Pakistan, I wanted to actually do that because nobody wanted to do that. So I had to go out and actually create a position where I could curate these exhibitions and prove that this was possible, that you could actually bring together work of extremely high quality internationally and make a program for a museum, and the museum could run. And I did this for 6 solid years at Hermitage in Norway. When the opportunity arose, I grabbed it with both hands. I took it, I ran with it. I could actually put my money where my mouth was. I could present the work of artists from India, artists from Africa, artists from the Soviet Union, artists from Kiev, for example, artists from Canada, you name it. I literally internationalized a program in museum world, which was specifically white and European, put it that way. That was one reason. When I came to giving talks and lectures at art academies in the UK, there wasn't a senior Black lecturer in all the London art schools. I was the first, when I got appointed, I was the first senior Black lecturer at what is today the University of the Arts in London. It was not a pleasant experience because my colleagues at the time were thinking, what is this guy doing? What is he coming to do? And my job was actually specifically to change the student intake, to change the curriculum, to change who was being taught. Those are the three key roles I had. I had to change staff, I had to change the subject, and I had to change the student body. And I sounded like I'm doing it myself. It wasn't, there were 4 or 5 of us because there were 4 or 5 colleges, but we all worked together to change that. And today that is a reality. When I came to lecture at Chelsea College of Art, for example, I think the number of students who were from a non-European culture was something like 0.5%. You know, the year I began teaching at Chelsea School of Art, one of the first students we took in was Chris O'Feely. 5 years earlier, Chris O'Feely wouldn't have had a chance to get into an art academy in the UK. No chance. Simply because he was a Black kid making some very radical stuff in his work. The moment I saw his work, I said to my dean, if we do not take this student, I am going to create a protest. And we took him. And the result was he's one of the most successful students ever in Chelsea College's history. So these were things, and the same thing happened with art institutions. I was appointed to the Arts Council because at the Arts Council, this was the legislative body that took a large part of taxpayers' money and shared it amongst basically white institutions. When I joined the Arts Council, I think we spent on cultural diversity, we spent £200,000 out of a budget of £206 million. That was the amount of money we were dedicating to this issue. When I left the Arts Council, it was 8% of £230 million. And that was a change that had to happen. So I had to go into these institutions and do this work. And at times, this cost me work in my studio. For example, when I went to Norway and didn't paint for almost 20 years, I didn't mind that because it was an important thing to do. And I had a large body of work that was constantly in circulation. In all of the years that I was curating, I was always included in some form of group exhibition. I didn't have a solo exhibition, but I was always included in some form of group exhibition. So this is a story that you have to tell as a background, because if you look at my work and you look at these jumps and changes that are made, you ask yourself, why did you do that? Maybe this is the answer.
Gavin, you've had an enormous impact in every sphere that you've worked. And I just want to mention perhaps how you've impacted my life. Because
yeah, we've crossed over a couple of times. Yeah, that's true.
You were absolutely critical to imagining an organization called Innova and bringing it into existence, the Institute of International Visual Arts, which was the first organization to really to be funded as it were, permanent client of the Arts Council in the visual arts, dedicated to to internationalize the canon and what was being produced and disseminated by showing both the work of diasporan artists in the UK, but also artists from Africa, Asia, China, all over the world.
Yeah.
I just want to come back to something about this tension, and this sacrifice in a way that you know, I wonder, you know, how many colleagues at University of the Arts London would have had the responsibility to change the curriculum, change the staffing profile, change the student intake, in addition to being artists and teachers of art. But just to leave that to one side for a second, I want to talk about something with this shift from work which is figurative and very explicitly political, to work which, as you said so eloquently, creates a space for the imagination. And I know a number of South African artists and writers who, following the fall of apartheid, rather than continuing with work that was explicitly political and addressing the struggle, embraced the opportunity to create spaces of the imagination. I wonder if you could say a bit more about what that means for you personally, but also what that means in terms of your practice.
I think that I had come to a point where, like I say, in the Gaborone Festival in '82, there was this big question of the main theme of that conference was a question of what are we going to do? And this was there were over 600 artists of all disciplines. There were actors, there were playwrights, there were novelists, there were a lot of musicians, there were visual artists, you name it. And we all came together in Gaborone, just 6 miles north of the South African border. And the main issue for us was, what was art going to be like when apartheid was no longer there? By '82, the writing was on the wall. Everyone was very clear that apartheid was going to disappear. It took another 10 years, but we were quite aware of this. And the question was, how are we going to react when the key subject, which actually involves, drives our work, was no longer there? What was then going to replace it? And I think a lot of artists today still struggle with that, knowing or trying to find something else in the world of art, in whatever discipline you work in, that is not focused on this horrible inhumanity, that is not, you know, that we can find something else. I think when I look at the issues in my time and the issues today, where you have mobile phones communicating imagery within seconds. In 1970, when I started, just to find some form of text, some form of image that's related to apartheid was extremely difficult. It was not easy, you know, and I think that one of the things I found I could not do now, as much as I would love to be participating in something like Black Lives Matter, which would be wonderful. I think that the shift towards an alternative way of dealing with this issue, the issue of Black Lives Matter is issue of liberty, it's the issue of freedom, it's the issue of expression. And I think these issues can be found in other approaches to how you make an artistic expression. Like I say, my early work I found was instructive. It was informative. It presented this issue in great detail. You know, the South African coloring book, which is actually hanging in MoMA right now and hanging in the Tate at the same time, which is so strange that I don't know how many artists have actually had that experience of having the same work in two big prestigious venues at the same time. But that was an instruction book. I made that for my student colleagues who knew nothing or very little about the realities of South Africa. And it was an attempt to say to them, this is what happens to Black people who work. This is what happens to who work on the mines. This is what happens to women in South Africa, etc. This is what happens to the culture of South Africa. I think that working the way I do now, culture can be seen as completely diverse. I'm not asking everyone in South Africa to stop making work that's concerned with violence and apartheid, and the post-apartheid reality, which is very bleak and should be addressed. I'm saying I addressed it in one, but I think there's another way to address it. And what I notice in the art world is that there's a sense of expectation. There's an expectation that if you come from South Africa, you have to make art that is about. And that's what made me move to painting in the first place, that every time I showed my prints, we never really spoke about the quality of graphic art. We spoke about history, we spoke about politics, we spoke about statistics, but we never talked about visual expression. So I thought, all right, I'll shift this and maybe poetry was a way to address it. So the images became poetic, the titles disappeared, the work remained untitled, and you therefore had to look at, but there were still recognizable images. And I found that you could take that a step further. So when I reopened my studio and started practicing again, I said, what is there left to do in this field of painting that is not what I have already done, but could still somehow deliver the sense of liberty, the sense of freedom, the sense of identity, without a written commentary, without even a title, but a sense of expression, a sense of feeling that you arrive at through engaging by using these two things in the front of your head called eyes.
That's a lovely segue to my next question, which is really about this this shift or opposition that you've set up and articulated about moving from reading to looking, from the verbal to the visual. I mean, England is a very literary society and often uses words to prop up or surround the visual when it kind of doesn't know how to deal or how to respond in the way you're talking about to that invitation from a painter, from an artwork, to engage with it on its own terms without any contextualization or narrative. And I wonder if you could talk about that, because you've also been a writer, a very eloquent writer. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about what the possibilities of the visual for you are that are different and separate. I know you also love music, and it's interesting that you use Nina Simone, because in some ways there's a synergy here, isn't there, between,
I've in the publication we're preparing for my Sharjah exhibition, I've written a long essay about this very issue, this very status of what does painting mean for me, and what do I get from it, and what is it that it offers the viewer. Like I said, one of the things that, as you said at the start, the shock is if you see this body of my work and you see this activity, this hyperactivity, an artist as an activist, a political activist, a cultural activist, and then there's a break, and then there is an artist who presents other artists' work, which is my curatorial, and then there's this shift is so radical to some people that they can't believe that it's happened. They come to me and say, why did you do it? And I say, I did it for you, basically, because I think what it does is it confronts the expectation. And if art has done anything in its history, it has always been to confront expectation, to say, if you think the world looks like this, there's this other approach, there's this other angle that artists take up as a creative challenge to say, I will find an alternative to this that will make you return to that original position of disbelief and to realize that there's something else. What's his name? Who used to be the head of MoMA, Kirk Vonnegut, wrote about abstract painting as pictures of nothing. And he said, when pictures of nothing become something and meaningful to you, that's the most important moment. that's when you realize that this stuff that artists work with, this material that we put down on layers, one layer up at a time next to another on a sheet of canvas stretched over a frame, that there's nothing there that you actually can read as you would read a text, but there, you read it as a sense. And that sense is very dramatic, it's very moving, and it can change your life. I write in this essay that if I took you to Victoria Falls, or I took you to the Grand Canyon and you'd never been there before, you will stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon and you would not need any words to acknowledge its magnificence. You would just simply go, wow, this is phenomenal. I've never seen anything like this. This is really unbelievable. And there's an emotive moment of that realization. And that's not an exaggeration, but if you bring that down to the same experience of walking into a space and you stop, and I always ask my students, why did you stop at this particular work when you went into a gallery? It's because your eyes are telling your brain to instruct your legs to stop moving, because your eyes are engaging with something that is caught your attention. That is, for any artist, the moment of, I suppose, success, if you want to level success in any give it any dynamic range. If you can stop somebody in their tracks to reconsider what they were going to do and get engaged with what you have presented them in the visual field, then I think you've done something. You've achieved something. And sometimes it's horrible, and sometimes it's pleasant, and sometimes it's questionable, but I think that moment of interaction, of getting somebody to interact with something you've created, that puts a question in their mind, that dissolves expectation, and you are left with nothing other than, I've got to start from somewhere else. I don't know what to do with this, but I enjoy being here. I like this experience. It's telling me something about me. It's not what others are telling me what I should be. It's me telling myself. And this is the difference between having an image such as the one behind me and having a portrait of Nelson Mandela. It's a difference, but it's the same thing.
Gavin, thank you. That's wonderful. And it just makes me want to see these paintings. I've been fortunate enough to see some of them. I haven't seen this new one that you've just made, but it's tantalizing to see them on screen, because I know that the experience of confronting these paintings physically is such a radically different experience. And I urge everyone who has the opportunity to come and look at your work in its physicality. We have some questions now. I think if we can open this up to the floor. There's a question here. What is next for you? What project are you planning next?
Just this. I will be, when I reopened my studio, I said I would give myself 2 years, and if after 2 years I wasn't enjoying myself, I would probably give it up and start writing, or in fact I was going to make videos about art. That was one other alternative idea that I had. But I have never had so much fun in this last 7 years of my life. I go into the studio with such enthusiasm. I put on Nina Simone, I dance around the room, and I start working. And it's such a delight. And I can't tell you what the next project will be, but as I said, I tend to work in series. So what you see behind me, for example, is one of 6 angular paintings that I've made. And there's another 5 other big canvases sitting in the corner of the studio, which I'm working on. So I'll just continue and push this experiment, the results of which you see now on the screen, and keep pushing that experiment and seeing what is still available. What can I do with this material called paint that gives an image which is like nothing I've ever done before, but still has some kind of meaning and importance to my life, that I can enjoy sitting in a room looking at it and not feel that I should take a knife and stab it in the middle and tear it apart, which is something I would never do. But just this feeling of being engaged with something, visually engaged with something. And like I say, I go and see, works by artists who today are radical and practicing making radical political art. I enjoy that very much. I applaud what they do. I have no regrets leaving that field. I think it's, if people today want to continue doing it, applause to them, continue, if you feel that's what you need to do. But this is what I feel I need to do. I need to make this stuff that's on my walls in my studio right now.
There's a question here from Alison Young, who says, you spoke earlier about the fact that you moved to painting in part because discussions about your prints tended to revolve exclusively around the political content and not the aesthetic character of the work. How are you finding the reception of your new abstract paintings? Are viewers, commentators? Still, let me just finish the question. It's a long question. Still, I know,
typical Alison.
Still reaching for some expected meaning linked to your identity or personality, or are they now inspiring deeper discussion about the visual?
I think that last point is very important. It's a deeper discussion about the visual. One of the other cliches is this cliche about identity, that because of who I am and my historical background, identity is one of the key factors. I don't even want to go there. I'm a human being, full stop, and I make art. That's it. So what I'm producing, what I'm putting into the discussion, into the discourse, both theoretically and actual through image, I hope others will enjoy. This is how the so-called mainstream of art has dealt with mainstream artists. You don't ask, you don't ask Ansel Kiefer about his identity. You don't ask, I'm trying to think of, any young contemporary artist about who's making work that's in the popular upper echelons of the gallery networks. You don't ask them about their identity. You just accept the work for what it is, and you talk about the work. And that's what always irritated me. I came to Europe to work in the field of arts, and I wanted to do that. And then I had to do politics, and I had to be an activist, and I had to be a cultural interpreter, and I had to write text because nobody had written these texts. This is what I had to do to get into the discourse, and I've done that now, and I don't want to repeat that. So I'm just looking at enjoying, I suppose, the rest of my life making paintings, and whether I'll go back to making prints, I hope I will. I'm looking to see if there's ways in. I think I've found one. And even the possibility of making sculptures. I don't know. These things will come naturally. They will tell me, just as a painting, when I'm working on these things, the painting tells me what to do and when I should stop. I don't control it. It controls me. What I may make will be similar. I'll have an idea one day and I'll come into the studio and start working on it, and it'll lead me somewhere. I enjoy that experience, and I think that's the pleasure of being an artist.
There's a question here from Frank Mowry, who's asking, do you still experiment with media? I remember when you were painting with acrylic paint and you added sand, it gave a texture. Now your colors are transparent. Are you using standard pigments?
I'm using standard pigment. I gave up making my own painting. Antonio Tapias, when he was alive, I met him in Paris, and I was starting my first paintings. And I said to him, how do you make this paint that you? And he told me how to do it. He said, you just take glue and you put pigment in it. It's a lot of physical work, but you have to make your own, and it costs you less than 1/4 of what commercial acrylics. And commercial acrylics in those days was very poor. It had very little body. the color range was not as vast as it is today. So a lot of things were wrong with acrylic. So I made my own acrylic paint. And what I do now is I use commercial paint, but I use it in a very, very, very particular way. The paint that I put down is very, very thin. It's a little bit like washes, like milk. It's not heavy. If you look at these canvases, sometimes you can see the actual mesh of the canvas is still absolutely visible. In my other paintings, it'll be covered by a centimeter or more of paint. So these works have a delicacy that arises through working and reworking and reworking. You don't get just one color. You get, if you are painting a yellow, you'll most probably paint 5 or 6 versions of that yellow to get the quality of the yellow that you want. If you're painting a blue, the same. And so you're painting and you're over painting, you're laying things next to each other. And these pictures they have a delicacy and a kind of a breath that I like. I always said it's like jumping into a very deep body of water and everything changes. If you're in a deep body of water, there's no up, there's no down. The light comes from everywhere. There's no front and back. You float, you feel different, your body feels different. These paintings have that kind of sense about them. You enter them completely differently. You step from the ground you are in the gallery, you step into them mentally, and it carries you away. And that's it. And that's the quality of the paint, has to encourage that, I suppose.
I think that's a lovely place to end, Gavin. will hold an image with me every morning of you putting on Nina Simone and dancing around your studio before beginning the practice of paint, the daily practice of painting. Well, all I can say is if the daily practice of painting and Nina Simone produces such wonderful paintings, please don't stop painting.
I won't. I won't. Thank you very much, Gilane, for this talk. And thank you to the people at Yale for inviting us to do this. It's a great opportunity. I've only been into your museum once, many years ago when I was on a lecture tour. I'd love to come back and see the gallery again now that it's being renovated. So, yeah.
Thank you, Gavin. And thank you to the LC.
Thank you to everyone who's listening.
Jane and Linda and Courtney. And thank you, everyone who's joined us in this virtual space. A space for the imagination. Thank you, Gavin.